and welcome to tonight's panel discussion, or book presentation, I should say. This has been a very whirlwind month here at the Institute, so culminating this month with Oliver Bullough is a blessing. I just found the fact this is the first time he is presenting to people from the Caucasus. So, writing about the book, going around the world, traveling countries, this is the first time, so I think he's a little nervous, he says here. So let's make him welcome. I'm going to read a little overview here. The reason this book is so important tonight for Circassians and the people of the Caucasus is that Circassians have been airbrushed out of existence by the Tsars, then by the Soviets, and now today by Putin's state. It is part historical travelogue and part journalistic reflection on the past and present-day sufferings of the people of the Caucasus. His background: he graduated from Oxford University in 1999 and stayed 7 years, I believe 7, in Russia, and went back home to London and was fed up, I think, pretty much with the Caucasus. He was disturbed what he saw. However, all the information he had to put it on paper, and that's what this book is here. It's a culmination of him traveling to 12 countries and interviewing Circassians and people of the Caucasus for this book. Today, he is the Caucasus editor for the Institute of War and Peace Reporting. And I believe last night, yes, he did. He won an award last night in New York City. That's what he's here for this particular book. And I found out just now as well, he's on the short list for the Orwell Prize, which is Britain's most prestigious prize for journalism, and that's for this book as well, right here. So I am now pleased here to introduce Oliver Bullough.
Hi everyone. I am really nervous. Normally I'm just talking to an audience of British people and I can say more or less whatever comes into my head. Now I've got a sort of audience of fact checkers. I was just talking to my friend Sabra, who I came with, who's a former colleague, and she said to me, these Circassians are great, they're so friendly. And I was like, oh, you know, why do you think I chose to write a book about them? And I thought I might talk today about that question. Why did I choose to write a book about you guys? I'm from Wales. I have absolutely no connection by blood or heritage to the Caucasus or to Russia, it sort of came about by a giant coincidence that I should get interested in your part of the world at all, and that was because in 2002, when I moved to Moscow. Previously I'd lived in St. Petersburg and in Central Asia. A month after I got there was as many of you probably remember, a group of Chechens took over the theatre in the centre of Moscow. This was until then I'd been a very sort of fairly happy-go-lucky, easygoing sort of guy. I'd left university and more or less worked my way around the former Soviet Union in a very light-hearted way. This was the first sort of major story I'd ever worked on, and I became gripped by it and appalled by it, and I didn't understand how in one country two nations could hate each other so much as the Chechens and the Russians appeared to do. And so I started reading everything I could find about the Caucasus and hassling my editors to say, you know, let me go to the Caucasus, let me go up, you know. At the time, writing about the Caucasus was the great job. It was what everyone wanted, because it was the most interesting, the most exciting, and above all, you got to go to the Caucasus because, I mean, Russia has many charms, but it's not necessarily a very friendly place to live. But you know, going down to Nalchik or to Vladikavkaz or to Grozny was always, you know, it was a laugh. It was fun. People were friendly. So I about 6 weeks or so after the theatre siege, I went down to historic Circassia near Anapa to write about the Meshetian Turks, who are one of the many nations who were punished by Stalin for their ethnicity. They were deported from what is now Georgia to Central Asia, and by a number of unfortunate and very cruel accidents. A lot of them ended up at that time in southern Russia, Krasnodar region, which is just about the worst place where they could have ended up, because it coincided with a great upsurge in Russian nationalism, and a lot of extreme Russian nationalists who pretended to be Cossacks and spent their time persecuting anyone whose hair wasn't the same colour as theirs or their nose wasn't the same shape. And these people's lives have been a sort of a litany of suffering for, well, the last 70 years or so, and I must say I wasn't expecting to have a good time. It was going to be grim. And I went down for the weekend, and I arrived in this house, and I sat down, and we all sat on the floor around the table, and I sort of waited for them to say something, really, because I was still very inexperienced. I didn't really know, how do you talk to people whose suffering is something you can't even imagine? And one of them said to me, "You're a Christian, I imagine." This is a really bad start. I mean, I thought, we don't really want to bring in a Muslim-Christian antagonism in, and I was like, oh dear, well, what do I say? I said, well, yes, I suppose I am, but not a firm one or anything. I mean, I don't have a problem with you guys, and they said, well, we're Muslims. I said, yes, I know that, and they said, of course, as Muslims, we don't drink. And I said, oh, no, I recognise that's true. And they said, well, as Christian, you probably do drink, don't you? And I said, yes. And they said, well, if you'd like a drink, that would be fine. I said, no, it's fine, I can get by for a few days without drinking. I'm not an alcoholic. And so a pause, and one of them said, if you wanted to drink, we as Caucasus people, our sense of hospitality is so huge that we would have to let you drink. And I said, no, seriously, I'm not an alcoholic. I can get by without drinking. And
they're forcing you to become
one. They clearly thought I was some kind of advanced moron, because then they said, and if you were to want to drink, we would consider it very rude to make you drink alone. And I, by this stage, even my dumb brain got round what they were wanting to say. So I said, oh, well, in that case, yes, I would very much like a drink. And out came the bottle of vodka from under the table, and we spent the next 2 days getting gloriously drunk and having an absolutely wonderful time. And this was my first introduction to how much fun it is to hang around with people from the Caucasus. It wasn't an entirely typical experience, but it was extremely enjoyable. And I did get a story out of it. I don't know if it was quite the story I was expecting to get. But basically, this cemented for me the fascination with the country and the countries to the south of Russia and the regions in Russia's south. So I fought harder and harder with my editors to make sure it was always me who got to go to the Caucasus. It was always me who got to go to Chechnya and to Dagestan and to Nalchik. And then again, a few weeks later, I was doing a story about Chechen refugees in Ingushetia. And I was talking to a woman who lived in a tent. The tent was about a sixth or an eighth the size of this room, and she lived in it with a dozen children, about half of whom were hers, about half of whom were her sisters, but her sister was dead, her husband was dead, her brother-in-law was dead. She had no source of income of any kind. She had 12 children to bring up in a muddy field in a tent, and she had just about the best sense of humour I've ever come across. And this demonstrated itself in the fact that in this tent, in which she cooked on an open gas flame, they had nothing at all. They had an enormous television. I mean, a television that was way bigger than the one I had in Moscow. And they didn't have any electricity, which was surprising. And I asked after a while. I felt we'd got to know each other enough for me to ask why they had a television. Turned out an NGO had come to see them to ask what they needed. And she would have done with a washing machine, a cooker, a drying rack, a whole lot of things that you need when you're trying to keep 12 children clean and fed in a muddy field. But she hadn't been in, and the kids had been in. So the NGO came and they asked the kids what they wanted, and they wanted a television. So they had a television, and she thought this was just about the funniest thing she'd ever heard. So I left this tent absolutely astonished. And then by one of those, so I've written about this in the book, so excuse me for all of you who've read the book, you know the story very well. I left the tent in sort of amazement at this wonderful woman, and as I walked out the tent, the clouds opened, and there were the Caucasus. It was the first time I'd seen them. The Central Caucasus Range. You could see all the way across. You could see Kazbiergi, all the way across to Elbrus. From far away, you could just see the loom of it on the horizon, and I was absolutely smitten. So I spent, the next 4 or 5 years, I spent as much time as I could in the Caucasus, a lot of time walking in Svaneti in Georgia, and at that time it wasn't, well, it still isn't, sadly, safe enough to walk alone as a foreigner on the Russian half of the Caucasus, but the Georgian half was fine. I spent a lot of time in Vladikavkaz. I had very good friends all the way up and down Dagestan and Chechnya, and of course all the way to Nalchik. But as you probably know from remembering what was in the news from the Caucasus in those years, the stories I was covering were sadly not happy stories. It was suicide bombings and Beslan, a lot of death, and eventually I left Russia in 2006, and I had absolutely no intention of writing anything about the Caucasus ever again. I'd loved the place, but the events were too horrible. But my cousin, who's my mum's cousin, my uncle, we're very close. He asked me to speak to a society that he's a member of, and I couldn't refuse him. So I went to speak to the society, and I talked about what I'd seen and what I'd done, and he sort of introduced me. I spoke, and then afterwards, this old woman came up to me, and it was very sort of one of those tough old women who who really, a lot of them in Russia, they get things done, and she just said very simply, "When are you writing your book?" And I hadn't ever thought about writing a book before, but I started thinking about it. I started going to the library, the British Library, a lot to read about the Caucasus. And the way I did this is I typed Caucasus into the search engine, and anything that came up, I just went down the list. I just ordered book after book after book. And after about 2 or 3 weeks of doing this in my spare time, I came across a book about this place called Circassia. And I'd never heard of Circassia before. I'd lived in Russia for 7 years, and I'd never heard of Circassia. And I read about it, and Circassia didn't seem to be located on the map anywhere where Circassians now live, and I couldn't really understand what was going on here. The Longworth and Bell, they were landing in Tuapse and Gelendzhik, and these are Russian towns. I've been to them. I've been to Novorossiysk, and these are there may be some Armenians there, but other than that, they're just Russian towns. And I began to wonder, what happened? How is it possible that a whole nation that as recently as the 1830s, when British travellers wrote whole books about them, were there and vibrant, and they were the only people living there? How did it happen that suddenly they vanished? And at this time I was very lucky to meet one of London's most active Circassians, Zainal Beslaneh, who's a very good guy, and we sat down over a cup of coffee in central London near the institute where he was studying, and he started telling me about it. And in Moscow I considered myself a specialist on the Caucasus. I knew all about the Caucasus, and this was a genocide that I had never heard of, and I didn't know anyone else had ever heard of. And so I set myself to learning about it. I read all the books I could find, which weren't, as you know, very many. And then I went travelling, and I started in Kosovo, and I met, a dozen Circassians that there are left in Kosovo's Circassian community. And then I went to Istanbul, and I met, I don't know, it's hard to tell in Istanbul, millions. And then I went to Kayseri, and I went to Trabzon, and I went to Kefken, and I went to Adapazarı and Dubje and everything. And then I went to Israel, and then I went to Jordan, and I had a really wonderful time. I started off, I knew one Circassian, I knew Zainal, that was it, but that was all I needed. So if you know one Circassian, they introduce you to another Circassian in the next town you're going, and then they tell you another Circassian, and then you go to them, and then you go to the next one, and by the time I finished researching the book in the Middle East, I had a network of friends in every town I could want to go to. But obviously, the book wouldn't be complete unless I went to Circassia itself. So I took the boat across the Black Sea from Trabzon to Sochi. In the accounts by the English travellers who visited Circassia in the 1830s, one of the great motifs of the books is always the amazing welcome. They would come ashore in their ship, and there'd be guys on horses, waiting for them, and they'd be, met, and everything would be this riot of welcome, this mad sort of magical party atmosphere, and as they're made welcome and sat down and given, food and drink, and everyone comes to meet them, and it all this sort of wonderful chaos. I didn't quite have that when I arrived in Sochi. I got off the boat. I was immediately detained by a fat man He looks very like a pig, actually. He didn't so much detain me as just take away my passport, which is a very effective method of detaining someone if ever you need a way of doing it, particularly in a country where if you don't have a passport with you at all times, you're liable to be arrested. So I and a small and rather sad gaggle of Turkish men who had been stopped in a similar fashion, we were led away to his office, where I was informed, after being made to wait for an hour and a half, that I had broken 3 Russian laws. One was that I had a business visa and I was in Sochi, which is a resort. There was no conceivable reason why anyone would be in a holiday town with a business visa, so that was obviously a criminal offence. I also, the organisation that invited me was in Moscow, and yet I wasn't in Moscow, so that was obviously a criminal offence. I can't remember what the third one was, but it was of a sort of equivalent level of seriousness. And I had to pay $200 to get my passport back. So I argued with him for a while, but eventually I thought, well, there we are. So I gave him his $200 and I walked out and I thought, what have you done to Circassian? I was no riot of people welcoming me on the beach. There was a fat man in a uniform who made me pay $200 to go enter his country. And I travelled up and down. It is amazingly beautiful, as those of you who've been there know. The mountains drop straight into the sea, and the thickly wooded slopes of massive profusion of sort of tree life, but of the Circassians in Circassia, that part of Circassia, obviously not in Nalchik, but of that part of Circassia, there is almost no sign at all. But I did have. I obviously needed to go to see Krasnaya Polyana, where the Olympics will be held, and I had a guide, very enthusiastic, who claimed to be a Cossack, but every Russian in that part of the world claims to be a Cossack, so I don't know whether it's true. And he took me there, and he was a really nice guy, very friendly, very open, but talked to him about Circassians and asked him why the Circassians didn't live there anymore. And he changed completely. He became a bigot, in a word, which was a great shame, because it's very awkward when you're talking to someone who you like very much and then they turn out to be a bigot. And he was talking, but eventually I got bored of contradicting him, because that's no way to hold a conversation really. And so I just sat down and let his conversation wash over me, and I was sitting under a tree. This was in Krasnaya Polyana, and I looked up and realised I was sitting under a pear tree. It was in the, if it had been growing in Britain, it would have been 200 years old, but thank you very much. But this was in the mountains, and presumably trees grow more slowly there, so who knows how old it was. But it definitely was planted by someone who liked pears, and that person could only have been a Circassian. And so it was wonderful to know that no matter what you do, and how hard you try to erase the traces of a people, something always remains. And I am delighted, absolutely delighted, to have had this opportunity to come and talk to you all today. You are one of the last Circassian communities that I hadn't yet visited. Sadly, I couldn't wangle New Jersey into an itinerary that started in Kosovo and ended in Jordan. But I'm here now. I visited 12 countries to research my book. That number is now 13. But it has not been an unlucky 13. It's been extremely lucky. As my friend Sabra says, everyone's just so friendly. So thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And if anyone had any questions for me, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Yes, please.